Okay, hi everyone. My name is Linda Tucker-Cerniak. I'm from Oregon State University, and today I'm going to be talking about the muddiest point in the biology laboratory and how providing low-effort feedback might affect quiz scores and attitudes about learning science. Next slide, please. So for the past maybe about 2 years, as I've been TAing for introductory biology labs, I've been using the muddiest point, which is basically just asking students to reflect on what they've learned each day and identify what the most confusing thing from that lab session was. I've been having them provide that to me in their lab groups, and then I would go on the web and find different web content like YouTube videos or interesting websites and provide that into a feedback email each week. So since I've been doing this for about 2 years, I was wondering, does that actually have any kind of effect on their learning? So for this project, I came up with the question, does providing these feedback emails actually lead to higher quiz scores? And also, does it increase favorable attitudes towards learning science? Because I've noticed that a lot of my students, when they get frustrated with certain material, they kind of don't seem to enjoy it as much. So I was hoping that maybe clarifying some of their confusion would actually increase their favorable attitudes towards learning biology. And again, this was an introductory biology laboratory for life science majors. Next slide, please. So what we did in our labs is our labs are about 40 students and they work in 10 groups. So we asked each group to come up with the muddiest point for the lab of the day. Then we would go find the web resources and provide them with the feedback email before the end of the week. And for our treatment group, we had 7 lab sections. And for our control group, we also had 7 lab sections. So the only difference between these 2 labs was whether they had the muddiest point or not. Otherwise, the lab content was the same. They had the same introductory material. They had the same exact assignments. Even their lecture was exactly the same because they all had the same lecture professor. So they all took 2 lab quizzes throughout the term. And then at the end of the term, we invited them to take the Colorado Learning Attitudes About Science survey. At this point, they would answer a bunch of questions about science, and they'd also, at this point, give their consent to have their grades and survey responses used in our study. And after we collected all of this, I did a few statistics on this. I built linear mixed models to see how the muddiest point affected lab quiz grades, taking into account gender, class standing, and their GPA. And then I also did a t-test on the Likert Scales for the survey data. Next slide, please. So this is the beginning of our results. So these are for the 2 quiz scores. So as you can see here, the control group actually performed a little bit higher on these quizzes. But looking at the mixed models, there actually was no relationship at all between muddiest point and the quiz scores. So we didn't see any significant results there. Next slide, please. So this is for their total lab grade. Since we didn't see any significant results for their quiz grades, we thought, okay, well maybe it'll have an effect somewhere else since there's lots of things we're doing in lab and lots of other ways to measure learning. So we looked at their total lab grade as well, and we found a very similar result. The difference between these 2 grades is less than 1%, and there was no significant result here either. Next slide, please. So last, we looked at the Likert Scales for enjoyment of learning biology from that class survey. And you can see here that the muddiest point group is very, very slightly higher. However, that still is not a significant result. It was super non-significant. I don't have the result on the p-value on me right now, but they're very similar. So when we looked at all 3 of these analyses, we found that using the muddiest point really didn't have much of an impact on student learning or enjoyment of biology. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? So it means that low-effort feedback such as an email might not actually be sufficient to address student confusion or improve attitudes. Something like maybe an in-class activity might be more appropriate. However, there were some limitations to this study. For example, each lab instructor created their own lab quizzes, so it is possible that some quizzes were harder than others. There was also a little bit of standardization of quiz scores. If a lab section did really, really terrible, like it was below a C average, we would adjust the scores to bring the average up to the C range. Also, students may not have actually read the emails, so if they didn't read the emails, they obviously wouldn't benefit from the feedback from the instructor. But more interestingly, I found that students who actually consented and took the survey were actually very high achieving students. As you saw a few slides back when you looked at the two lab grades, they were almost identical and they were right around the A range. And the students who participated, about 50% had a GPA that was 3.5 or higher, and about 32% had a GPA between 3.0 and 3.5. So these are really high-performing students, and they probably already know how to study. They probably already know a little bit about how they learn. So they're doing well, and the muddiest point might not actually help them as much as a lower-performing student would. Next slide, please. So future directions for this, I would really like to include more students from a wider range of academic performances, just to see if maybe those lower-performing students actually would benefit from the muddiest point. And I'd also like to study a more diverse group of students as well to understand if the muddiest point might also help out underrepresented minorities as well. But our data set, even though we had 189 students participate in this, it didn't really have a lot of diversity academically or with ethnic groups and minorities. Next slide, please. So I just want to acknowledge that this was conducted with the approval of the Oregon State IRB board. And we want to thank the graduate teaching assistants for Biology 211 for assisting us with our study, and the Department of Integrative Biology for allowing us to conduct our study in their biology labs. Next slide. And any questions for me?
Thank you, Linda. Again, I welcome, great job on your project. And now we have time for questions. Again, welcome to raise your hand if you have a microphone and you want to share that with the room, or just go ahead and type your question into a text box on our whiteboard.
Okay, what fraction of students consented to participate? That's a good question. It was somewhere around about a quarter. It differed between labs, but it was roughly a quarter of the students. How was the muddiest point determined? So the students came up with the muddiest point on their own. So we just asked them, what was the most confusing thing that you learned in lab today, and they would write it down. Can you use the read function of emails? I actually don't know how to do that. I know you can send read receipts in the email system, but I actually sent it out as an announcement for our in Canvas, our system. It sends out an announcement which then emails all the students. So I'm not sure there is a read function in that, but I could probably do that if I sent it out as a regular email. Or ask directly. Yeah, that would be a good use. Oh, there's so many questions now.
Yeah, a lot of questions, Linda. Great.
Oh, I need to fix. Let's see. Let me address the GPA. GPA was not a significant predictor, and I think that was probably because they all had really high GPAs to begin with. Let's see. How much time do we give them? They have as much time as they want. I ask them to keep it pretty brief, but if they want to spend 5 minutes on it or 10 minutes, it's basically just at the end of the lab. They do that before they leave. So it was variable. Usually they would complete it in less than 5 minutes. And
Linda, let me just ask and jump in here. Were there any surprises in your data, or could you parse out other maybe specific changes in the class that you noticed?
Well, I mean, students really seem to enjoy this, even though I didn't see any differences in the data itself. But in my lab sections and the other TAs, as I would talk to them about this, said that their students really enjoyed it. They really appreciated that the TAs took the time to ask them about this and give them the feedback. So it might not have had an academic kind of effect, but certainly it helped build the relationship between the students and the TAs, and they really appreciated that.
Or maybe affect motivation, perhaps, or some kind of meta-learning skills that students didn't consider previously?
Yeah, perhaps. Something was perhaps not exactly measurable in what we did. Yeah, definitely. Let's see. So I think, let's see, low effort but no effect. We continue with them in the future. I am continuing them. I still do them. We're actually doing another study this term right now. We're going to see if we can encourage more people to reply to the survey so we can get a bigger survey view group. But we are going to continue to do them. I will continue to do them. I still have faith in them. Let's see. is there a quantification of whether the students looked at the feedback on the muddiest points? I don't. That's a good idea to ask them if they actually looked. I have asked them from time to time if they got the emails, and a lot of them said yes, but I don't have any quantification on whether or not they looked at it or not. Let's see, what else? Oop, okay.
Time's up, but if you want to maybe, Linda, answer one more question as we transition. So this question was, I wonder what would happen if you connect the clearest points to their actual comprehension.
That's an interesting idea. You know, I didn't ask them. I asked them what their kind of favorite thing we learned in lab was, but not like what the clearest was. So that actually might be a better way to phrase it, what was most clear to them. Yeah, that's a good idea. That's something else would be really interesting to investigate, whether the muddiest point or the clearest point, and addressing those might somehow have a better effect than the other. That's an interesting idea. I don't know what the answer is.
Well, another project.